How do you structure your no-code app in a way that makes it easier to scope and easier to sell? Now, I'm not talking about structure in a technical sense. We have a ton of other content that goes into that, but I'm talking about how to structure it as an offer, really, that people want to use and buy. And how do you do that in a way that makes it a lot easier for you to build it and build it quickly, and a lot easier for you to sell it once you're ready to launch and grow your business? That's what we're going to dive into today. Now, make sure you stick around until the end, because we also have a worksheet that I want you to use after you go through this video that's going to help you take the next steps as well. So stick around for that. Now, first, if you're new around here, my name is Kristen, and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help non-technical entrepreneurs build custom apps so they can either launch their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses, all without coding and no technical background required. Okay, so how do you structure your app in a way that makes it easier to scope and easier to sell? And the very first thing you have to do, it's really easy. We have to make sure we know what we're working with. So when you are building and launching an app, what you're doing is you're taking a problem that you've identified with your target market, and you are providing that target market, your prospective users, with an outcome. Okay, that's what we're looking at here. And your app is right here, this line, okay, that takes people in your target market from having that problem or those problems you've identified to having that outcome or outcomes that they want to achieve. Now, in order to make this work, you have to actually understand what the problem or the problems are. And this can seem straightforward if you have identified just an actual straightforward problem. That might be what you're solving, but problems actually exist in three ways. And one of these you've thought of, but the other two you probably haven't yet. And that's where it also becomes more important with making sure you are providing value, really packaging your app up into being an offer that people want to use and pay for. So what we want to look at now is how to identify the three layers of problems that your app needs to solve in order to provide that value. So at the very bottom here, if we're looking at this pyramid, we have the actual problems that users are experiencing and that you've identified. This is the straightforward problem that you know in your business, in your industry, with whatever it is that you have knowledge in, right? This is the actual problem, the tangible one that you are solving. And this is where you're going to be focusing the main processes of your app on. Okay, so those core features that you're going to be building, the must-have features, those solve the actual problem. Okay, so if the actual problem is that a business or businesses in your industry are struggling to gain leads so that they can convert them into sales and grow their businesses, well, the main processes in your app might be helping generate leads or helping filter leads or things like that. Okay, so the technical pieces of the app, but that's not where it stops. And that's the problem that I see with a lot of people, is that often is where it stops. But there are a couple of other layers on top of this that when you solve these extra layers of problems, you add more and more value to your app. So the next layer is external. Okay, so you can solve the actual problems with a tool using technical processes, aka the features of your app. But no matter how well your app works, there are always going to be external problems as well that add on to a person being able to use the processes you've created to solve that root problem. Now, what I mean by that is things like time, money. Okay, these are external problems that can still keep people from being able to solve the problem. So if you have a core set of processes that solves that root problem, well, if people don't have enough time to use your app, right? Or if you haven't made it so that the processes happen faster, or that the app is easier to use in a more straightforward way, that it cuts back on time, right? Well, that's going to be an external problem. So again, your app can technically solve a problem, but if it takes too much time, well, that's an external problem that now you also need to solve. Okay, money, it's the exact same thing. If people can't afford it, well, that's an external problem. It doesn't really matter how good those processes are that you've built. If people can't afford it, or if they don't see the value in it, right? So maybe they can afford it, but they don't see the value. Well, those are external problems on top of the technical processes that you need to solve. Okay, now on top of that, we have internal problems. Okay, so when we're looking at your prospective users, internal problems are things like motivation or even commitment. Okay, so if you have your technical processes, they solve the problem, and you've made it so that they can solve the problem in an ideal amount of time, and they see the value, the problem is affordable to solve, or they see the value and it's worth spending the money on, well, then you have to look at those internal factors that might still hold a person back from using the app effectively. This can be a lot of different things, but for example, motivation and commitment. Now, it can seem like we're taking a big step back from the tech space here, right? How much does this really matter? But in reality, it does. And this is where you see things like gamification in apps. This is why you see things like progress bars being put onto multi-step processes or forms. It's because of the motivation and commitment. And when we're talking about it here, it can sound really deep, but when you see it in an app, when you see the solutions to this, or the things that try to solve this in an app, it can actually look pretty simple. So the reality is, someone can have the tool, they can have the time, they can have the money, but if they're not really motivated to keep using that tool, if they don't put it into their daily processes or their weekly processes, if they just don't continue to use it, well, that's a problem that's going to keep them from solving the root problem. So you have to look at every single one of these things, right? All three of these, and you have to put all of them in place when it comes to your app. Now, this doesn't mean you're building more and more, but this means that you're getting pinpointed and making sure that you are putting the right value pieces into place, right? And what this is actually going to do, at the start of this video, we talked about how is this going to make your app easier to scope and easier to sell. So what this really does is it makes sure that in the beginning, you're focusing on the components of your app that are actually needed to provide value, which means that you're going to be able to scope those out more easily, and we'll talk about that more. And if you're focusing on value right from the start, then you're going to have a lot easier time selling it. Most people tend to focus on the product right from the start. And when you sell a product, it's not as easy as it's a lot harder than it should be, I should say, right? When you sell a valuable solution, well, things become a lot easier for you. So let's look at this a little bit further. Down at the bottom here, right? When we look at scoping this out and putting the pieces into place at the right time, when you're solving the actual problem. So we're talking about the technical components, the features, the processes in your app. This is where you are providing that root solution. So you're identifying the core problem that your target market has and the core outcome that they want to be able to achieve. And you're building the thing that takes them from, right, point A over here over to point B over here. Okay, so that is the actual, right, problem and solution down here. Okay, now your main processes that you create to solve that actual problem, there should only be 3, 4. I mean, if you're going over 5, you're going well beyond this, so that it should be limited, because you want to stay focused on one core problem versus trying to solve a bunch of problems right from the start, because really what you want to do is make the core solution work first, make sure it works, and make sure you can sell it, make sure it's valuable, and then make it better. Okay, so we're looking at the first solution down there, and then on the next layer up, we're looking at making the app adoptable. Okay, so if we have the main processes down at the bottom, so the main features and functionality of your app, and the next layer up is where we're solving those external problems, what you're really doing here is making the app adoptable, because you can have an app that works, but if users aren't able to adopt it, then it doesn't really matter. So what you're doing here is you really want to make sure that the problem you are solving is valuable to people. Now, how can you do that? Well, our examples on here are time and money, and those are really easy to look at. So how long is it currently taking for someone to solve the problem that they're solving, right? How much energy and effort and time are they currently putting in, and how can you bring that down? How can you make it faster for them, right? That's an external problem. Time, it has nothing to do with your features or processes, but it can keep people from using those features and processes. So how can you really just distill the amount of time it takes? And money. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean to charge less. What it really means is how can you make sure that you are creating a solution that is just valuable, that people want to pay for. And if you're creating processes that solve a problem that's causing them a lot of pain or frustration, and you're compressing the amount of time it takes them to get the outcome that they want to achieve, well, even if you're charging a higher price point, then the app is still going to be valuable in their eyes and worth that higher price point. So that's really what you want to look at here. It's just making sure that the app is valuable and that it's adoptable, right? You're actually allowing people to take that product and now put it in their pockets so they can use it moving forward. And then the next layer up, those internal problems, this is where you want to make the app more sustainable. So how can you take the solution you have, get people to adopt it, put it into their pocket, and then retain them, really help them use it over the long run, which comes back to our examples of that motivation and that commitment, right? And these can be really, really simple touches, just making the app easier to use. Right now, you don't have to get fancy, especially if you're looking at your first version. That doesn't mean make it as fancy and as sleek as you possibly can. Really, instead of looking at more, you want to look at less. How can you take things away to make the app simpler? Because the simpler it is, the less likely a user is going to get lost or sidetracked along the way. The more streamlined it is, the easier it's going to be for them to come in and just continue to use it day after day. But you can also put some really simple touches in the app to keep the motivation high, to keep the commitment high, to make it even enjoyable to use. I mean, something as simple as, sending an automated email out when someone hasn't logged into their dashboard after X number of days. That can be it's a plug and play thing, right? You set it up once, and then it works forever moving forward. And things like that, they can take minimal time to set up, but they can boost that motivation, they can boost that commitment, and they can make it sustainable. So the person has the tool, it's in their pocket, it's ready to go, and then they keep using it again and again and again moving forward. So up here, looking at solving some of those internal problems. Now, in reality, you can take this and expand on it in so many ways. We're just scratching the surface here, but I want you to be able to look at, well, first, kind of lay the groundwork for what you're working with. Taking the problem, right? Providing an outcome. So you're solving it. Your app is the solution. Your app isn't the outcome, right? So we're not focusing on the product. We're focusing on the processes that take the person from the problem to the outcome. But in order to do that effectively in a way that makes your app easier to scope and easier to sell, you have to break the problems that a user has down into these 3 levels. So what's the actual problem that you can solve via processes? And how can you do that in a simple way that solves one problem and enables one outcome? Of course, you can build on top of that, but lay the groundwork, right? And then on top of that, what are the external problems? Often these look like time or money. What are the external problems that, even if the solution is in place, are going to keep a person from taking that solution, putting it in their pocket so they have it to use? And then after that, what are the internal problems, right? Person has a solution, the processes are there, they work, app is in the pocket. What next? how do you keep them opening it? How do you keep them going back in and making sure they're actually using it to achieve that outcome, right? All of these, every single one of these, well, all three of these layers and all of these examples and more add into the value. And if you focus on that, then you're going to have an easier time scoping your app, making sure you're building the right things. And you're not just building things that you think might be cool or fun or neat to have in the app, but you're building things that matter and that you're building value, which is going to make it easier to sell. Now, the next step from here is to actually scope out those technical features so that you can start putting these pieces into place. And so if you're at that point where you're in your idea stage, now you want to scope everything out, make sure you're focusing on the value so that you can move forward with a quicker launch, an earlier launch, and easier traction. Then the exercise or the worksheet that I want to add on to this is over at coachingnocodeapps.com/perfect-pilot. So perfect-pilot. If you head there, you'll be able to make a copy of this worksheet and go through a step-by-step, really practical process to make sure you're building the right features at the right time so that you're focusing on the value, you're focusing on the solution, and it's going to keep you from really just falling victim to scope creep, potentially getting caught up in features that aren't necessary and that aren't going to play into what we've talked about today. So head to coachingnocodeapps.com/perfect-pilot to grab your copy of that. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you in the next one.